And so what's going on with Truman's Fair Deal, this big progressive agenda that he promised to bring about in America? Well, it's going to have some limitations. So some goals he did accomplish, very few. One, he is going to get social welfare increases. The minimum wage is going to go up. We're going to see a little bit of extension of some Social Security benefits. They're going to be expanded to more people by declining the age that you needed to be in order to gain some of the benefits. But that's about it. So he promised massive, massive New Deal type expansion. He got a higher minimum wage and some slight increases in Social Security, which are important gains, but not what he was hoping to accomplish. The more important area where he does have some gains, although not to the extent that he was aiming for, was in the area of civil rights, where the two major things he's going to do, and both of which are exceedingly important. Most famously, because it's just it's easier to see, basically, the gains, is going to be when he desegregates the military. So as we see in this newspaper that posted in the picture here, Truman wipes out segregation of the armed forces. As the armed forces are directly under the president, he has the ability to just order them to desegregate quickly. He doesn't have to rely on Congress to pass a law or do anything like that. And so he does. He immediately orders the desegregation of the military, and this becomes a huge thing in America because it becomes this very visible, intangible evidence that the president is saying, Americans, whether you like this or not, this is a direction we're going. You need to adjust to this. And whereas there are going to be people that don't support this, there's going to be a large number of people that do support this. And sadly and ironically, we see in that newspaper clipping right below this desegregation, such an important step for civil rights, that we also see this under states' rights articles, posse bent on lynching searches woods for prey, which shows us that things are not changing as much as many of us would obviously like them to. But Truman is starting to do what he can to try and change things. And again, this picture that we see below is a picture taken soon after the time period, where if you look carefully in the picture, there are soldiers in this new platoon, some of which are white, some of which are black, some of which are of Latin American descent. But long story short, what we're seeing is a new military. And again, some people are not supportive of these changes, but large numbers of people will be. And we'll just start to see more and more of these changes in the post-World War II era that will cause pushback in some regard, but also cause a lot of people to support them in others. And so that's going to be a major gain. Another major gain is he's going to start to, which it's harder to have a picture of this, he's going to order the Department of Justice to start to support African-American plaintiffs or organizations supporting African-American plaintiffs, especially groups like the NAACP, and civil rights focused lawsuits. And this, whereas it sounds just kind of like a bureaucratic step, it's actually an exceedingly, exceedingly important step, because when the Department of Justice is willing to support groups like the NAACP in promoting civil rights legal action, this is going to lead to some major victories. And in fact, when we come back and start to learn about the development of civil rights in America in this post-war period as kind of a separate topic on its own timeline, you're going to see that a lot of the court cases that start to become victories for the groups like the NAACP begin in the year 1950. Groups like lawsuits like Sweat versus Painter, or McLaurin versus Oklahoma, or the most famous Brown versus Board of Education. And why are these cases starting to happen? Well, in large part, it's because of, just heroic action on the parts of groups like the NAACP. But in many other ways, it's because the federal government was offering the resources of the Department of Justice and the U.S. attorneys and just all the different components that our Department of Justice has in an effort to support civil rights lawsuits that they now are applying to these groups. And with these extra resources, extra lawyers, extra opportunities, we are seeing major, major opportunities for civil rights gains that will now be experienced. But obviously, the fair deal is largely going to fail. If it didn't, then we wouldn't have been talking about this the whole time. So what's going to happen? Well, one, Truman wanted to propose that we expand the Tennessee Valley Authority, not just to the Tennessee River area, if you remember the utility program from the New Deal, but also to the Missouri River and then possibly the Mississippi River. So we'd have this much bigger government public utility that would be a major step towards more affordable utilities for large numbers of Americans, especially in rural areas, but that does not happen. Another thing, he's obviously not going to get a Medicare law or a national health care law passed. Another thing, these programs where he wanted to support federal aid for education, especially in low-income areas, and help for college, that's not going to pass, apart from the GI Bill that had already done that, but just for veterans. just in large part because of opposition from multiple different groups that didn't want the federal government to get too involved in the education systems of America. The Taft-Hartley Act is obviously going to stay and has not really been undone ever since that period, but this was the first major attempt to try to do it. And the limitations, where we're not going to see any civil rights legislation that ban discrimination in housing or in public accommodations or businesses. And we're also not going to see anti-lynching legislation passed. So these are some major, major setbacks that Truman had hoped to accomplish, but Congress, whereas it was still Democrat majority in this time period, so you would think Truman would be able to get some of this stuff done. He wasn't, because a lot of these Democrats were the Southern Democrats that obviously do not support much of this, which is why they had kind of separated from the party and formed the Dixiecrats in the election. And so, long story short, with Truman's Fair Deal kind of not picking up the momentum of the New Deal, we're going to see some major setbacks in the midterm elections of 1950, where progressive Democrats, at least, are going to lose majorities, where between conservative Democrats from the South and Republicans, they retake the Congress. And with a conservative Congress and a progressive president, there's just not going to be much room for passing laws. And why was that in these midterm elections? Well, in large part, just America just wasn't into progressivism too much, not everybody. But in much more reason that we'll cover in the next PowerPoint that we'll do later, it had to do with foreign policy. In 1949, it was a major, major setback for Truman's foreign policy, where it looked like, up till 1949, it looked like he was winning the Cold War. After 1949, it looked like he was losing the Cold War. And by 1950, we had the Korean War begin, which did not have a very good start. So by November of 1950, when the midterm elections we had the major setbacks in the Cold War of 1949. The Korean War is not looking very good in 1950. And so with that, there's major setbacks for the Truman and progressive Democrats in the midterm elections. And so we're going to see political stalemate ensue. And in the midst of that period, where the Cold War appeared to be going very badly, we're going to see the rise of the second Red Scare, the much more famous Red Scare, the one that President Trump alluded to a lot when he was claiming to be a victim of this new McCarthyism. Well, it's from this era that he's referencing in these documents, or in his tweets, I should say. So what is the second Red Scare? Well, obviously, it's going to be a lot like the first Red Scare. It's going to be this massive, massive surge of paranoia where Americans think communists are infiltrating our country. Now, the second one is going to be bigger and scarier to people because unlike the first one where there was really no evidence that communists were infiltrating our country, in the second one there was some evidence, and that is going to cause, this little bit of truth makes people very, very concerned. And so what are the things that start to give people pause? Well, the first thing is when Canada announces that they found out the Communist Party in Canada was connected to the Communist Party in the Soviet Union. And so when Canada announced that, it started to make us think, okay, the guys, even though Eugene Debs is dead by this point, but guys like Debs, these socialists that we had in America that we used to think, they learned from Marx, but they weren't necessarily directly connected to the communists in the Soviet Union. Well, if they are in Canada, they might be here as well. The second major cause that's going to start to cause people to say they might be here is when a magazine, it was called Amerasia. It was a magazine that was kind of the monthly mouthpiece of the Communist Party in America. And again, it was very small. Very few people read it. But they actually published top secret classified documents from the U.S. federal government. And so when we start to look at this communist magazine that has access to classified information in the United States, now we're starting to say, well, how did they get that? So we know the communists in Canada had ties to the communists in Russia, and the communist magazine in the United States has this. So people start to say, maybe the communists are here. Maybe the Russians have infiltrated us, just like we knew Stalin had access to the Manhattan Project plans that were also top secret. Now we're starting to wonder, maybe there are spies in America. Now, Truman doesn't think there are. So Truman's going to create what he calls his loyalty program, where basically he's going to do background checks on the entire federal bureaucracy. If you worked for the federal government, you were being tested for your loyalty. And out of the over 2 million background checks that were conducted, I think it was only about 6,000 were then set aside for a secondary review. And out of those, not one single person was fired for failing the background check. that basically no ties were proven. And so Truman's going to announce these findings. Now, granted, several dozen people did quit their government job in response to being investigated, which, I mean, maybe they just felt like their civil liberties were being violated. Maybe there were connections to the Communist Party. We don't know. These people quit and left their jobs, so it is what it is. But because of that, Truman's going to announce that there are no communist spies in the federal government and people need to not react. That's what he's saying in 47, but he is a Democrat. There are Republicans in the Congress, and so the Republicans in Congress are going to say, nope, we don't believe you. There are communists. And so Congress is going to conduct its own investigation. And if this is starting to sound eerily familiar to what happened with President Trump, saying, nope, there are no ties to Russia. The Department of Justice has confirmed this, just like they did in Truman's loyalty program. And then the Congress saying, we don't believe you. We're going to conduct our own investigations. Yes, there are some parallels here. So what we're going to see is the rise of the committee, the special committee that was set up initially to look for Nazis in our country. That was the HUAC, the House Un-American Activities Commission. But now, after World War II, they're going to continue it. And it's going to be an organization that is now looking for communist spies. And it's going to be led by House members like a young congressman from California who was very conservative, he was very paranoid, and he was very smart and capable at conducting investigations, even to the extent of basically violating a lot of people's civil liberties and creating a lot of victims that he did not care a whole lot about. And this will be a foreshadowing of his presidency, and that is young Congressman Richard Nixon, one of the leaders of the HUAC. So what they do is they basically investigate a bunch of people, and they will call them to testify in front of the House and give them information about anything they want to figure out if people are communists and if there are communists in the government. And there are several important cases. One of the things that comes out of the HUAC is the Hollywood blacklist, where a lot of famous actors and directors and writers and producers were investigated for being communist sympathizers. One of them was Frank Capra, if you're familiar with him, very famous director and producer, and who had made the movie Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. He made the movie It's a Wonderful Life. He had also been in charge of creating federal propaganda for World War II from our government. And so he will be investigated, and he will be blacklisted. They'll say, yep, you do have ties to communism, so we are going to put you on this blacklist, and Hollywood will not hire him. He will not be able to secure a job making movies or writing movies or producing movies. And many other people were investigated as well. Probably the most famous was Humphrey Bogart, who was a famous actor during this time period. And so he's going to be very angry. And when he and several of his other co-stars are accused of being communists, he actually writes this op-ed that's put in the Hollywood Actors Screen Guild magazine, where he basically says, no, I'm not a communist, as you can see in this picture of him. And he starts to say how wrong it is that people are stepping up and doing this. So we see Hollywood celebrities basically opposing the government changes going on in America. But either way, for 13 years, there was a blacklist in Hollywood where a lot of people were not able to get jobs. All right, probably the most famous case to come out of the HUAC is the Alger Hiss case. And it takes over 2 years, as you saw with the Russian investigation and the Mueller hearings and all that. You know, these investigations do take a long time. And Alger Hiss was the Deputy Secretary of State. So he was high up in the State Department. And he was a guy who was accused of Whittaker Chambers, a guy that we knew was a communist spy, of being his connection to the State Department. And Whittaker Chambers claimed this is where he got a lot of his information. Now, Alger Hiss denied all this. And long story short, following a 2-year investigation, they could not find any evidence that Alger Hiss was actually tied to the Russian government or to the Communist Party. All they found was just some small-scale evidence where he did actually meet Whittaker Chambers before, even though he had claimed he had never met Whittaker Chambers. And so he will end up being found guilty of basically lying before Congress, and so perjury under oath. And so he will be fired from his job and be punished for that. And in large part, even though it looked like there was very little evidence, and it looked like the HUAC and the Red Scare was winding down, that all changed midway through this trial, where in 1949, as I referenced in the last slide, one of the major events from that era was when the Soviets developed their own atomic bomb. And the Soviets were not technologically advanced enough to do this, we didn't believe, without U.S. help. And so when that happens, we start to, the paranoia that communists had infiltrated our government intensifies. And with that intensity, we start to look for scapegoats. One of the scapegoats was Alger Hiss. And so even though we don't actually find evidence on him that proves he was a communist spy, he will be punished and fired and become a scapegoat for this under the crime of perjury. Now, if we want to skip ahead a few decades, I believe in the 2000s, or was it the late 1990s, Russian intelligence actually tells us that they were using Alger Hiss as a spy in this time period. Now, having said that, Russian intelligence has this method where they frequently disseminate misinformation just to confuse their enemies. So were they doing it because they were telling us the truth and they were genuinely trying to make better relations with us? Or were they just telling us this to kind of freak us out again about something that happened 40 years prior? It's hard to say, but either way, Alger Hiss will be one of the most famous people from the HUAC testimony. All right. The most famous trial involving the HUAC is going to be when they investigate the Rosenberg couple, Ethel and Julius, who both were considered Russian spies. Julius worked at the Pentagon and he was a custodian, so he had access to a lot of the rooms, as custodians have keys to a lot of rooms. And so, as a alleged Russian spy, he will be put on trial. In the investigation that began after the Soviets tested the bomb, we thought, well, how did they get the plans for the bomb? We determined that they got them from the Pentagon, so we figured there were spies in the Pentagon. Julius, we decide, and the HUAC was the spy, and his wife worked with him. So they were both Russian secret agents that were here. And what ends up happening, we put them on trial, and they will both be sentenced to death as Russian spies. The evidence, it depends what source you read. Some sources say, yes, they're definitely spies. Other sources say the evidence was sketchy. It really kind of depends on your take, but they will both be executed for the crime. And I want to say they're the last couple to actually be executed for the crime of treason in U.S. history. Since then, the death penalty, I think, has only been used for just murder, basically. And so the Rosenbergs become the couple that we decide was responsible for leaking the plans for the atomic bomb. And then in a very visual case, 1955, as the Red Scare was starting to wind down a little bit, we see Pete Seeger, a very famous musician in this time period. He's one of the leaders of the folk music movement that guys like Bob Dylan and groups like the Kingsmen or Peter, Paul, and Mary, if you're familiar with any of those old 60s artists, are going to come out of, or Johnny Mitchell or Joan Baez or just many of the other famous musicians. He was one of the leaders of that movement, and he will be accused of being a communist. So he will come in and testify in front of the HUAC, and he will actually more or less tell them that he is a communist, and he's not afraid to defend it. And because of that, he sort of gets blacklisted from America. Like, just a lot of people won't buy his albums because in this Red Scare period, they find that he isn't patriotic enough as a guy who isn't a non-communist or non-socialist. And so as a result of that, he will kind of lose a lot of his ability to have commercial success in the music industry, which honestly ends up being kind of important because with that, him being this guy that supported the downtrodden, he will, and kind of viewed himself as part of the downtrodden, he will actually then kind of leave the pop folk music industry and use his celebrity status to help aid other things, most famously the civil rights movement, as he will become one of the early leaders of the civil rights movement, lending his voice and his celebrity and his prestige to the developing civil rights movement. And he will march with Martin Luther King at times and other leaders in order to support civil rights. And in fact, he raises a lot of money selling the record We Shall Overcome, which becomes the civil rights anthem of the 1960s. And Pete Seeger, being a huge musical celebrity, will lend himself to that, which helps draw in a lot of people that might not have otherwise supported the civil rights movement because they supported him. And as he starts to do it, guys like Bob Dylan start to do it, and other leaders in the music industry like Joan Baez. And Bob Dylan will actually write one of the more famous folk songs in American history to support the civil rights movement, which is Blowin' in the Wind, if you're familiar with that. And so this event where Pete Seeger kind of loses his prestige in America, or a lot of it because of the HUAC investigation of him, ends up in the long term being a major a boon to the civil rights movement, in large part because of his willingness to support them. But the House is the lesser of the two famous Red Scare groups. The more famous is going to be the Senate committee set up to investigate communists, led by Senator Joe McCarthy. Okay, Joe McCarthy is going to be the head of the Senate committee that is looking into communism. And they're going to start soon after 1949, when people start to freak out even more because the Soviets testing the bomb. So he was a senator who got elected in 1946 as part of that conservative resurgence in America. He was from Wisconsin. He was a Republican. Wisconsin was not traditionally a Republican state by this period. They had become strongly Democrat during the New Deal. And so it didn't look like he stood for much ground to get reelected in 52. And so in 52, he decides, hey, I need an issue to run on. So he's going to run on the issue of I will be the chief fighter of communists in this country. And so he does. And he starts calling people in front of the McCarthy Committee and putting them on trial. And a lot of famous people are called in front of it. And the most famous example of this is when he's going to call the army in front of it. So he does get reelected in 52. So these trials are going to continue past 52. And a lot of famous people are going to be called in front of it, and he will destroy their career. He claimed to have a list that he kept in his pocket of all the different people that worked in the State Department. You've probably heard of other conservative politicians talking about unloyal people working in the State Department that are not loyal enough to a conservative political mindset or a conservative president. I wouldn't want to hazard a guess who that is, but these ideas are not new to this modern era. McCarthy used these ideas too, and so he would use these lists. And he claimed he had all this evidence of spies and this and that, and are you or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party in America? And he would put these hearings on television at times because, again, it was TV, which was becoming a bigger thing in the 1950s, helps to get this message across to people so that he can now make himself more famous and possibly publicize this cause that he is supporting. And when he puts the army on trial, he tries to say that basically all the higher-ups in the army are disloyal. All the higher-ups in the army are no longer part of our government and need to be punished, and we need new leadership. And the most famous example is when he brings in George Marshall. And here's pictures from the hearings where he's showing U.S. Army officials meeting Soviet Union military officials, which he claimed was proof that they were spies and connected to each other, whereas there are some who would say in World War II there were a lot of opportunities for Soviet military leaders and U.S. military leaders to meet us. We were allies with them, but, what do I know? I'm just a history teacher. And so what ends up happening is McCarthy claims this is the evidence that proves our military were, in fact, led by communists, including George Marshall, the Secretary of State of the United States, who was the founder of the Marshall Plan, and a lot of these things are going to be causes of the early victories in the Cold War for America. Well, now he is allegedly a communist. And so he's called before the Senate McCarthy Committee, and he is asked, are you a communist, basically? And he says, no, this trial's ridiculous. I'm going to walk out on you. You have no actual evidence. And when this all happens on national television, it embarrasses McCarthy, makes him look like a fool. And this becomes a major turning point in the Red Scare. So for about 7 years, America was very paranoid. We thought there were communists around every corner. The HUAC is telling us who they are. McCarthy's telling us who they are. But after this, McCarthy looks like a fool. So it's kind of like a Scopes trial moment, where the Scopes trials in the 1920s becomes this moment where it makes fundamentalism kind of look foolish. The McCarthy hearings, when they investigate the army, make this kind of Red Scare mindset look foolish. And by 1955, we're going to start to see that paranoia decline. And it's not just because of McCarthy. There's things going on that we'll learn about in the next PowerPoint that show us why people were ready to move on from this paranoid mindset. And so, was the Red Scare over? It appeared to be. It appeared that the Cold War had kind of found this more peaceful stage. And so we can now move on to life in general, the baby boom era, and just getting back to a prosperous economy. It's going to be one of the biggest takeaways from this time period is that our economy does start to surge in 1948. And this period of prosperity that's been unmatched in U.S. history is going to take hold. So following that post-war recession, we now have this prosperous era. So the first thing we're going to see is basically what's causing this. Because from 1948 to basically 1973, with just a couple little hiccups in between, we're going to see this period for over 25 years almost, just the GDP of our country, and not just the GDP, but people's access to wealth, is just going to astronomically grow. And the wealthy America that we have grown up in, where large numbers of people can afford healthcare and can afford homes and can afford to go to college, not that everybody can, but large numbers of people can. And large numbers of people can have 2 cars, and large numbers of people can move to the suburbs, and large numbers of people can afford electronics and new phones and new computers and all this stuff we have access to today. In large part, it is from this era of prosperity that begins after World War II. And so, what is causing all of this growth? Well, obviously, there's not just one single factor. There are tons of different factors. And the first is there's pent-up demand. All through the 1930s and in the early 1940s, people wanted new products. People wanted to buy things, but they couldn't. In the 1930s, people were too broke generally to buy things. In the 1940s, even though people had jobs as a result of World War II, there were no consumer goods to buy. So there was, for 15 years, people wanted to buy things, but they couldn't. And now, following World War II, people have a lot of money and a lot of demand. Now they're just waiting to unleash it on an economy, and they will. Okay, another thing is wages were going up. In large part, this is because of laws like the Fair Labor Standards Act that's increasing the minimum wage. In large part, it's because wages were going up during World War II. In large part, it's because this new white-collar service economy that's developing has higher wages. But now we have more demand and we have more incomes. People have more means to buy things. And so consumer demand and consumer means of purchasing things is going to be a major driving force in our economy. Another thing that's happening is the world following World War II. Unfortunately, World War II destroyed large amounts of the industrial areas of the globe. Europe had lost a lot of its industrial capacity. The Soviet Union had lost some of its industrial capacity. China and Japan had lost a lot of their industrial capacity, whereas the U.S. not only had not lost its industrial capacity, but as a result of war mobilization, we'd actually radically increased our manufacturing capacity. And following World War II, the U.S. is going to produce, depending what year you look at, between 50 and 60% of the global manufacturing output, which means a lot of money as the world is starting to rebuild. A lot of that rebuilding is going to have to come from the American economy. And so money from all around the globe is going to start spilling in to the U.S. economy. And that's going to be a major driving force in why our economy grows. And why does the economy not grow quite so much after 1970? Well, in large part, it's because the world is starting to catch up. They're starting to rebuild. They're starting to be able to manufacture their own stuff. And so a lot of our jobs are going to go overseas to these places where manufacturing is a little cheaper. And we're going to start to see globalization happen. But in the meantime, we are a major manufacturing giant, and a lot of industries are going to grow. Okay, another reason the economy is going to grow in this period is the government was investing tons and tons of money in it. We're going to start to see this phenomenon we're going to learn about in foreign policy called the arms race. And as the arms race was developing, our government is investing heavily in the military. New technologies like electronics and computer technology, or in aerospace like jet engines or space travel or things like that, which are all investments being driven in large part by our government, who want to use these things to improve our defensive capabilities. But this is also causing these sectors of the economy to grow. And a lot of these industries that began as, these defensive investments are going to start to turn into consumer investments. And some of the biggest industries to grow in this post-war period, as I referenced earlier, are going to be the industry of plastic, which we use for practically everything now, or electronics that I don't need to tell your generation and my generation how important electronics are, as they're the basis of smartphones and computers and all this other stuff we use, televisions, radios, CD players, VCRs, just all the other things that start to appear following World War II. And then aerospace, where jet travel and space travel, and just all the engineering jobs that come about as a result, electric engineering and electronics, the aeronautical engineering with aerospace, chemical engineering with plastic. So it's a big driver of this white-collar economy that's going to happen, and certain regions of our country are going to become very important in that. Like the electronics industry is going to become very big in California, Silicon Valley, or the aerospace industry very big in places like San Diego and Houston, Texas, and a little bit in Florida. And then later, as we skip ahead later in this era, some of these industries are coming to North Carolina. Like if you look at the Research Triangle, they're a byproduct of some of this investment, like IBM and GlaxoSmithKline or Klein Smith, whatever that company's name. They're just some of the other big electronic and engineering companies that are going to rise up in this era. But either way, this is driving the economy as the government's investing in these new industries. They're going to start to develop more consumer mindset as they start to broaden their platform and reach. Another thing that's driving the economy is the baby boom. as people start to have kids in large numbers, which they did following World War II, from 48 to 63, as we referenced, the average birth rate in America goes from about 1.5, like it was in the Great Depression, to 2.5 or higher, depending what group and what year you're looking at, in which case there's a lot more kids. And these kids, as anybody who's ever been a parent can tell you, require a lot more investment. You're buying furniture, you're buying toys, you're buying bigger houses, you're buying more food, you're buying college tuition once they get older, if you can afford it. But they're buying electronics for them, and this becomes a major, major stimulant of the economy. And so, as you follow the baby boom generation older, when they're young, you start to see housing become a big industry. As they're a little bit older, toys, and we start to see major national toy companies like Slinky and Hasbro and all these other companies that become major toy manufacturers, or clothing once they become teenagers. And we start to see like pop music becoming a big thing as they become teenagers, in large part because teenagers like to have their own music so they don't have to listen to what adults listen to. Um, and then once the 80s roll around, a lot of these baby boomers start to get jobs in the white collar service economy. The financial sector will grow as they start to deposit their money in banks and in stock markets and things like this. And then, as I said earlier, like healthcare starts to get bigger in the 2000s and 2010s as a lot of them are starting to retire. But either way, a lot of this baby boom is driving economic growth. Another thing that's driving economic growth is low energy prices. The U.S. was producing massive amounts of oil in this time period, and we were able to bring oil in from abroad, which is going to be kind of a good news, bad news thing as we start to learn more about that. But either way, we have cheap oil, and that makes the price to produce and consume almost everything in America cheaper. And as it's cheaper, that allows jet travel to be cheaper, allows cars to be cheaper to maintain. It allows our utilities to be cheaper. And with people spending less money on energy, they can then reinvest that money into other things. Hopefully, we'll see that right now with gas prices plummeting, which is obviously bad news for the economy in general and bad news for the oil sector, and obviously, but hopefully it's good news for consumers as it frees up more money for them to spend on other things. Okay, but that's what we see in the Postwar World II era. Another thing that's driving economic growth is this massive surge of suburbanization. Okay, as more and more people are buying homes, in large part because of the GI Bill and stuff like we talked about earlier, but also sadly because of reasons like historians call white flight, as people are, as we saw more and more black families moving from the South to cities in California and in Washington and in the Midwest and in the Northeast. Now, people that have more money are escaping these new living situations to move out of cities into the suburbs, and historians call that white flight. We saw it a little bit after World War I. We're seeing a lot more of it after World War II. And not that everybody that moved to the suburbs was doing it for that reason, but a lot of people were, in which case large numbers of people are moving to the suburbs. And as they're doing this, moving into new mass-produced cookie-cutter neighborhoods like Levittown that you read about in your book, and I'll show you pictures of on the next slide, what we're seeing is this is a major driving force of the economy, as it's creating jobs, people that build homes, maintain homes, sell homes like realtors or loan officers or banks that, loan money for home construction or purchase. And so this is a major driving force in the economy. The home buying and home building create jobs. It creates economic growth. So regardless of the reason, whether it's a good reason or bad reason, it is a reason that is driving economic growth. Another one is education levels were on the rise, in large part because of the GI Bill. A lot more people are going to college, majoring in things like engineering and medicine and all these other things that will be economic drivers and be a source of this white-collar economy that's developing. And then another thing is, as we are starting to invest more in research, invest more in technology, invest more in a lot of this stuff, it's making us more productive. So the average worker is producing much more. It's getting to the point where even though our blue-collar workforce is shrinking, we're actually producing way more. I think the most famous statistic that would tell you of this would be like with the coal industry. Coal, obviously, a very blue-collar type job. You'll hear our president talk a lot about how he's going to save coal jobs and save the coal industry, talking about President Trump in the modern era. But in reality, it doesn't really need to be saved, so to speak. I mean, there are some things about it, like environmental regulations, obviously, create a dent for the coal industry. But a statistic that would tell you the coal industry is actually doing okay for the most part is the peak era for employment in the coal industry was actually this era we're looking at on the PowerPoint slide right now. We're basically, I forget the exact statistic, but I think it was roughly, was it 4 million, or I have to look at the book, but millions of Americans worked in the coal industry. Today, it's just a few 100,000. So the number of people working in coal has declined dramatically. So that is obviously, if you're looking at it just from the number of people that hold jobs working for coal, yes, it looks like the coal industry is dying. But tying it to this productivity bullet point here that we're looking at in the PowerPoint, it's not because the coal industry is dying. They're actually producing 4 times as much coal today as they were back then. So what's obviously causing? Why do we have 1/10 or whatever? I think it was 1/10, the statistic of the amount of coal workers in America, but we're producing 4 times as much. Well, in large part, it's because the average coal employee is more productive. So we're using way more coal today than we were back then, but we're using way less coal labor, as each worker now has access to things like Caterpillar equipment and all the other major industrial goods that we produce for the coal industry. And that is just one of 1,000 examples of how the average American worker is becoming more productive. And as the average worker is becoming more productive, that frees up surplus labor to go into things like the white-collar economy and stuff like that. Whereas now the worker in the coal industry can get paid more because they're operating more complicated machinery. And obviously we're oversimplifying the coal industry here a little bit, but I'm trying to do it to show how this productivity that's developing in our economy in this period is actually a very positive thing for driving economic growth. And a statistic to show you this, you can see on this chart, where basically what you have happening here on this chart is you see average real GDP per capita. And again, that can kind of be a misnomer, but it's also real. That means it takes into account for inflation. So it's not adjusting, or it is adjusting for inflation. So it's not just taken into the changing value of money, and it's per person. So what ends up happening? Well, throughout early 20th century American history, it was relatively flat. Even in the Great Depression era, we talk about these roaring 20s, right? Well, you can see GDP barely went up adjusted for inflation. So even though GDP was going up in that time period, it's not going up very much adjusted for inflation. So how good was the economy? Well, as we learned in the 1920s, it wasn't as good as people thought it was. And then the Great Depression. So it goes down, obviously. But then World War II, it goes up, obviously, because we were producing so much for World War II. But in that little post-war recession, it goes down. By definition, that's what recessions do. But now we hit 1948. That's where this slide begins. And what are we starting to see? Not only does it start to go up again, but it starts to go up exponentially a little bit as we move into the modern era. And so why is it going up so much? Well, in many ways, it's going up because the economy has changed, right? The average person in $2,000 now has access to roughly $35,000, whereas you go back to the start of the 20th century, the average person really only had access to $5,000. Well, what can you buy at $35,000 that you can't buy at $5,000? And the answer is a car, a house, electronics, all the things that a lot of us kind of take for granted today. So long story short, what is this massive exponential growth of the average person's ability to access wealth in our economy? And again, not that some people can't, large numbers of people can't, but large numbers of people can as well. And this growth that allows all of us, almost, or many of us, to have a much better lifestyle, it's a byproduct of what we're looking at on this slide. So what then are going to be the impact of this massive economic expansion? Well, there's tons. I would argue almost everything that happens from this point forward is a direct or indirect byproduct of the economic growth being experienced by Americans in the post-war period. One, we start with social mobility, where what we see is large numbers of Americans are going to be socially mobile in this post-war period. In fact, by the end of the 1950s, so as we're about 10 years into this economic growth, over 60% of Americans are actually going to be identified as living in the middle class. And that is completely unheard of. No society in world history has ever, especially as large as ours, has ever had a situation where over 60% of the country can live a middle-class lifestyle, where they can largely provide for their needs and have leftover money for their leisure. But that is a byproduct of this era. Typically in American history, that number is closer to 40%. So the fact it got as high as 60% was significant, and it is a byproduct of all this economic growth. And it really hasn't declined a ton in the modern era. It's declined a little bit. But we're still seeing large numbers of people being able to participate in a middle-class lifestyle. Another one is physical mobility. As more and more people are making money, and more people are making money doing different things like, moving out to the suburbs, as we see. So that's going to be a major, major change. There is a lot of infrastructure changes. As people are moving around, we start to see that commercial jet travel is on the rise. In fact, the commercial jet airline industry becomes a big deal. Companies like United or American Airlines or Delta will later show up These companies rise up in this period, in large part because we now have the technology to do it, and B, people have the money to spend on it. You go back to the year 1900, nobody would have money to spend on an airplane ticket. Now, large numbers of people have money to spend on it, in large part because of how much our economy grows. And with low energy prices, that happens. Another thing, we're going to develop interstate highway systems in this era, in large part because our society is flush with cash enough that our government can afford to build these highways. Also, because people now have the two-car home, where as people are moving out to the suburbs, people can take the interstate highway into work. Like if any of your parents work in Raleigh or the Research Triangle or Durham, if there were no interstate highways, you'd be talking about a 30-minute to 2-hour commute, depending what road you're talking about. And people could not do that. But with interstate highways, it becomes a 10 to 30-minute commute, depending what part you're talking about, as long as there's no traffic, which is never the case. Okay, but these things happen, so people can be a lot more physically mobile. They move to different parts of the country. They move to different parts of the city. They just move a lot. Obviously, cheap oil is a driving force in this, and that's a thing that helps promote it. But either way, these things are all results of the good economy we lived in. Okay, another thing that's going to start to happen is our economy drastically improves. America's always been a place that immigrants wanted to come to because we've always, for the most part, had a better standard of living than most countries around the world. But now that standard of living is becoming astronomically better. And so there's going to be this surge of people that want to come to our country. And eventually, the quota system that we started in the 1920s that try to limit this surge of people that want to come to our country, it's going to give way as large numbers of immigrants just want to come in, and our government eventually is going to cater to that. And by the end of the 1960s, the quota system will die. We'll see immigration reform take place under Lyndon Johnson's presidency in the mid-1960s. And large numbers of immigrants will start to come to our country. And that's going to completely change the dynamics socially and culturally of what our country is. And that is a byproduct. Again, immigrants have always wanted to come to the country, but in this period where the economy is so good, the surge is just dramatic of people that want to. All right, another thing, the life expectancy in America is going to go up dramatically, in large part because a ton of research is done on healthcare and people have the money to actually access this healthcare. In fact, if you look at the statistics, I don't want to misquote it here, but I think in 1940, the average American only lived to about the age of 60. I believe it was just above 60 in 1940. By 1980, the average American, or 1970, I should say, the average American is living to, I want to say it's 72. Today, it's 82. So basically, we have created a situation with our good economy and just with all the money that's invested in healthcare and in research, where the average human living in this country lives almost 25 years longer than they did just 50, 60 years ago. So we have created 25 extra years of life because of this good economy for the average person living here. You go back to the year 1900, it was roughly 40. Or not 40, I think it was 50. But either way, we have created just a much longer life. And we've done it in large part because of the resources we all, well, not all, but many of us have access to. And so that's a major change. Another major change is that with this increased money, there's going to be a massive increase in a desire to have consumerism as the two-car family and living in the suburbs and having nice clothes and clothing becoming a status symbol and cars becoming a status symbol and what toys your kids have becoming a status symbol and what your 401k is doing is becoming a status symbol and going out to restaurants becomes this symbol of leisure activity and going on vacations multiple times a year. But basically the American ideal has changed. We were a country that used to be the rugged individuals or the frontier thesis, or we were tough and we could do without, and that was the American way. And in the Great Depression, we did it, and in the World War II, we did it. But by the 1950s, the new American ideal is about having what you want, and you see a lot of culture, a lot of TV commercials, and politicians, and radio ads, and just magazine pictures, and just all the things saying, if you are American, you should have what you want. As we read in the Lost Generation books of the 1920s, it became un-American to do without. And so basically the American ideal has changed. So that consumerism we see in the 1920s that had a major setback in the 30s and early 40s, it's back. And it really hasn't gone away since. I think the pandemic that we're all living through, I mean, that's one of the major things that's changing. Our political officials are telling us, no, we can't consume. We can't go out and do things. We can't go to restaurants. We can't go out and shop. We can't do a lot of this stuff. And obviously that's a struggle for a lot of Americans because Americans have become this consumer nation. And that really becomes in this post-World War II era. And so again, pictures like this, where you have the family moving into their new home in the suburbs, or pictures like this, where you have the baby boom family with the new television set that their kids are going to watch. And you have this picture, which was a suburban development that had just opened that day. And so all these families are moving in and moving into their houses as a new street in the suburban development is now available. And you can see everybody moving in, the kids on the vans and the baby boom families moving into these cookie cutter homes. And this becomes the new American mindset. Not that everybody in this country shares it, but it becomes a product of this era. Another thing that this economic prosperity is going to drive is going to be some of the social movements we're going to learn about, whether it's feminism or civil rights. Obviously, there are many, many other and very important causes of those, such as sexism and racism and the obvious causes. But in some ways, you will see that these movements are also driven by the prosperity that America has experienced, where A, communities now have more access to wealth to organize movements, and B, there's more of a desire. Whereas second wave feminism that we're going to see in the post World War II era, especially in the 1960s, it's going to be driven in large part by a lot of leaders that are saying, hey, the economy's thriving, so why are women not going to be able to participate in this? Or likewise, you see that with the civil rights movement, where what gets lost in the civil rights movement a lot is that Martin Luther King's messaging definitely was in favor of civil rights and political equality and anti-discrimination, as it should have been. But it also was focused a lot on economic issues. Like for the last 5 years of his civil rights advocacy, he focused almost as much on poverty as he did on civil rights. In fact, what a lot of people forget is the March on Washington, where he gives the famous I Have a Dream speech. I mean, it was about political equality and whatnot. But the march itself, that in a lot of the speeches dealt with this, that Martin Luther King didn't give. There were several speeches that day. It was called the March for Jobs and Freedom. So the freedom, obviously, talking about the political equality that was sought after by the civil rights advocates, but the jobs, because again, people are not hiding the fact that America was very prosperous in this era, and this prosperity ought to be shared with more people, whether it's with immigrants, whether it's with ethnic minorities, whether it's with women. But this economic prosperity is going to be a major driving force in the growth of these movements. All right, another thing that's going to happen is the economic prosperity is going to create government resources that are going to allow a lot of these programs or a desire to see government programs grow. We're going to see massive expansion in federal benefits for education in this era that we'll learn about in upcoming units. We're going to see the interstate highway system develop. We're going to see our military broaden to the point where we can have a large standing military with the most advanced weapons in the world. We're going to see healthcare offered to all the poor and all the disabled and all the elderly, Medicare and Medicaid. We're going to just start to see a food aid offered to people, housing aid offered to people. So a welfare, a basic minimum income under programs like aid for families with dependent children. We're going to see Social Security expanded. So basically all these programs that are just massive, massive programs that most societies, there's no way they could afford them. And yet we create them in this era, in large part because of the prosperity that our nation had. Okay, another one, our foreign policy is going to change. As we move into this Cold War era, there's going to be a desire to stay involved in the rest of the world because, we don't want communism to spread. That becomes the mindset of the Cold War generation. But we also have the means to do it, where the U.S. is going to expend more on our military than almost the entire rest of the world combined. And there's going to be an American military presence in all but like 5 countries by the time we get to the 1990s, as the U.S. becomes this world leader that becomes the military leader of the entire developed and developing world. And why is that? In large part is because of a prosperity that supports this type of involvement. So basically, what we could say is that this prosperity that Americans will start to develop for the next 2.5 decades, and really hasn't gone away since. We've had some setbacks. Obviously, we've had some issues with, who has access to this prosperity, but there is still prosperity. And so it's going to literally lead to almost everything that's going to happen politically, socially, economically, and diplomatically for the next 7 decades. I mean, you could almost say that it's possible a president just got elected in the last few years promising a return to this era of the 1950s. And in fact, as we move into the 1950s, I think you're going to see more and more and more overlaps with different things that our president has promised to kind of return us to in this Make America Great pledge that he has offered us, that he got elected with in 2016. Because what he's doing, in essence, a lot of it is modeled after this life that we're seeing in the late 1940s and 1950s and into the 1960s. And why is there so much overlap? Well, in large part, it might be because that's when he grew up. But in all other part, a lot of the people that voted for him are people that have a desire to get back to more of the mindsets we saw in this era. But he is just the most recent example of how almost everything that has happened from this period, the 1940s and onwards, has been a direct byproduct of what happened in this era. And so with that, we will move away from domestic policy by looking at some pictures of Levittown, and then we will stop and look at what's going on with foreign policy in this era. So here are the pictures of Levittown. This was the massive neighborhood outside of New York, on Long Island, and then later there was a Levittown that was developed outside of Philadelphia as well. And so as you can see, the homes that were thrown up in literally just a couple hours because they were prefabricated in a factory. So you literally just lay the foundation, lay down the plumbing and electrical grid, and then once it all dried and hardened, you would then just come in with a crew and you could literally build these walls in about 2 hours if they were really trying to push it. And these homes were dirt cheap. They only cost about $2,000, which in today's money would literally be like 30 or 40,000 bucks, which for a brand new home, I mean, these weren't the nicest homes in the world, but to pay that much for a home meant large numbers of people could afford it. And so you see pictures like this where these developments, they just clear cut forest or farm or something, and then you just throw down hundreds of these things all at a time. And whereas Levittown is a specific development we see outside of Philadelphia and New York City, there's going to be developments like this all across America. It's kind of like what's happening with townhomes in Chapel Hill, where, I mean, the townhomes are a little bit nicer than these homes we're looking at here. But once again, they all look the same. They're the same development again and again and again and again, where people just, they have a desire to kind of move into this kind of mindset where they move in. The problem is the parents do, the kids don't always. Another view of Levittown there. And we're going to see like this youth movement in the 1950s and 60s, initially the beatniks, later the hippies and yippies and other groups like that, that are going to give way to this conformity of the post-World War II era and desire something different, desire some change. And out of that comes a lot of the things that are famous from the 50s and 60s, but this is the culture that we were creating in the 1950s. These baby boom families that are producing 3, 4, and 5 kids, living in the suburbs, dad has a professional job, mom functions within the culture of domesticity, and life appeared to be all fine and good, or so people thought at the time period. But having said that, we'll move away from domestic history and now move into foreign policy. But I will see you at the next PowerPoint.